So Card Dance starts with the same engine that we used a second ago in Card Wipe. Basically, it is a 3D engine that breaks a layer up into three-dimensional cards and lets us manipulate them. But instead of a transition, Card Dance is actually more of an animation system. You'll find it in the simulation section of the effects window. So if you look down here in simulation, you'll see the very first thing that we see there is Card Dance, providing, of course, that you have downloaded and installed the plugins. But there it is, Card Dance. Simulation really is, I guess, the best place to put it, although the filter itself doesn't simulate anything unless you feed it another layer. But we'll get to that in just a second. For now, let's apply Simulation Card Dance. So again, this is based on the same engine as Card Wipe, and if you look through here, you'll see a few things that are familiar. Rows and columns is something that we had in Card Wipe. And whether or not the rows and columns are independent of each other or columns follow rows. What that means is basically if you set it to columns follow rows, then if you type in a 3 in the rows, it'll automatically create 3 columns. And you won't have to actually enter both of those values. But I tend to keep things independent of each other. You can also choose a back layer, just as before. Choose Card Back. And then down here near the bottom, the camera position, lighting, and material positions that we had before in Card Wipe. No jitter controls in Card Dance, but that's okay because you could create jitter by using a source map, as we'll show you in just a bit. Now, I have to kind of apologize for all this stuff in the middle. Frankly, this is one of the most complex filters that you will see anywhere inside of After Effects. And, well, basically that's my fault because, after all, I did design the thing. But outside of this filter, you would probably have to look at something like Particle Playground to find something more complex than Card Dance. And the only person I know who can really make sense out of Particle Playground is Total Training's own Richard Lanehart. And Richard is to Total Training as Mr. Spock is to the Enterprise, or Songs About Hobbits. But we're going to go and look at Card Dance now. Card Dance, as I said, breaks a layer up into cards and then lets us directly manipulate them using the controls that are here in the center of the effects window. And in fact, Card Dance allows us to do something that you can't do anywhere else in After Effects. Card Wipe can do this too, but Card Dance is a perhaps more intuitive way to do it. And that is if we set our rows to 1 and columns to 1, it means we're now essentially manipulating one giant card. And then if we jump down to our Y rotation value, and adjust the offset, you'll see that we're now rotating that card. But because we've chosen a separate card back, this is actually the only place in After Effects you can generate a card with a separate texture on the back from the front. Pretty neat trick. Elsewhere in After Effects 3D, you can't do this except by creating duplicate layers that are offset by a little bit, and that adds to your render time. This is the only way to have separate textures on the front and the back of cards. That's a good thing to know. But Card Dance wants to make cards dance, not just an entire layer. So let's give ourselves 3 rows and 3 columns. So now we have enough cards to coincide with the rows and columns that we see on screen. And for the time being, I'm going to ignore the gradient layer 1, gradient layer 2, rotation order controls. And we're just going to concentrate on the offset values that we'll find here in X position, Y position, Z position, X rotation, Y rotation, Z rotation, and the scale commands. In fact, let's just concentrate on the rotation and the scale commands. Let's set ourselves a keyframe for offset here at frame 0, and then we'll jump to 1 second into our composition, or thereabouts, and set our offset value to 180 degrees. And now, if we go back, you can see that that flips all of our cards together 180 degrees around their Y-axis. At 1 second, let's open up our X rotation value, set a keyframe for offset, and jump out to 2 seconds and set an offset value of 180 degrees. So now, after we rotate around the Y-axis, we're going to rotate along the X-axis, and that'll flip our cards back to their foreground cells. So we flip around, and then we flip over. Now this leaves us with a bunch of cards that are now upside down, so we're going to affect our Z rotation now, which is rotation along the Z-axis. That's towards and away from the camera. Set a keyframe for offset here. Jump out to 3 seconds and set this to 180 degrees again. And now everything's back to where it started from. Okay, I'm going to hit the U key so that I can see all of these keyframes. If I just click on offset, shift click on the other 2 offset values, I've selected all my keyframes and I'll hit F9 to smooth those keyframes. Now let's take a look at what we got. Well, by golly, those cards are dancing. See where it gets its name? Those are dancing cards. All right, let's add a little scale in here, which might add a little bit more dynamic energy to the effect. Once again, back at frame 0, I'm going to close down my X rotation, my Z rotation, and open up my X scale and my Y scale, and we'll set keyframes there for offset. Tap U a couple of times, and I'll pan up my timeline so that I can reveal the keyframes that I just created, and I'm going to select those and copy them. I'll jump out to 1 second and paste, jump out to 2 seconds and paste, jump out to 3 seconds and paste, and now I'm going to jump between any of these two values, and I'm going to adjust my offset values down here in the timeline to something like 0.7. I'll hit the tab key to go to the next one and go 0.7 on that as well. And that will give us a slight scaling value as my cards rotate around and scale back up again. So we'll jump back out to between the next two, copy those first 2 0.7s that we created, copy and paste. Jump out between the next two and paste again. Now we'll select all of these values, hit F9 for easy ease, and let's take a look at the effect now. So just by adjusting the offset values, you can create really interesting card animations here in After Effects. Really dynamic stuff. And of course, this is a fully 3D system with camera controls, with lighting controls, just like Card Wipe, just like Shatter. But of course, that's not as far as things go with Card Dance. If it was, I wouldn't have given you that prelude telling you how complex this plugin is. No, in fact, we're going to close down this introductory composition and open up the next composition, Luminance and Gradients, and talk about how you can really start getting interesting things out of Card Dance. Now what we have in here, similar to a couple other plugins that we've looked at, is our Beach Balls layer, which already has Card Dance applied to it, as a matter of fact. If I hit the F3 key, it'll bring up our Card Dance effect palette. Scroll that out of the way. But also within this composition, we have several gradients, a ramp, gradient twirl, we've seen these before, a clock wipe, something called Neapolitan, which is black, gray, and white, yummy, and our bands, as we've already seen. And what we're going to do is use these gradients to control the values that we see in Card Dance. For example, if we set as our gradient layer 1, our Neapolitan gradient, remember that was black on the left, gray in the center, and white on the right. And if we go down here to our, let's say, Z rotation value, and tell our Z rotation to use the intensity of gradient 1, which is our Neapolitan layer, what it's going to do is it's going to sample that layer. It's going to see those black pixels, those gray pixels, and those white pixels. And it's going to generate numeric offset values, just like a displacement map. And by adjusting the multiplier connected with the source, we can actually affect our layer. So if you look at our image back here, we've already rotated it into 3D space. As I crank up this multiplier, it's actually going to rotate tiles that are being affected by the black pixels to the right, tiles that are affected by the medium gray pixels, not at all, and tiles that are affected by the white pixels to the left. Okay? And once again, this only emphasizes an incredibly important thing about using displacement maps or gradient maps in After Effects, and that is neutral gray represents neutral displacement. Typically, values lighter than that will result in a positive displacement, and values lower than that will result in a negative displacement. So that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing black values give us a clockwise displacement, and white values giving us a counterclockwise displacement. So you can animate cards spinning in different directions at the same time by simply using a map to control things. Now you have two gradients to choose from up here. Let's pick another gradient. Let's just pick our ramp. Remember the ramp, it's black at the top and white at the bottom. It's a smooth gradation. And now if we told our Z position to use the intensity of gradient 2 as its source and adjust the multiplier, you'll see what's going on here. It's actually pushing the bottom cards towards us based on the white values, and the top cards away from us based on the black values, and the center cards are hardly moving at all because they're close to center gray. So by combining different gradients, we can actually control our cards in really, really interesting ways. And of course, the offset values I showed you a second ago work in conjunction with these gradient control values. So if I was to go to my Y rotation and adjust my offset value a little bit, you'd see that the cards are all turning there and will stay turned at 10 degrees no matter what else happens controlled by the various gradients. Now, I urge you to experiment with the gradients that are here in this composition. See if you can predict what the results are, and then try a few things out and check and see if your predictions actually match up with your final results. There's also been a camera move already pre-animated for your viewing pleasure so that you can view things in their full 3D glory. But as you're experimenting, you may notice that there are inherent limitations within this particular composition. And the limitations are around the fact that all of these gradients that are at your disposal are grayscale files. And you only have 2 gradients that you can choose from up here. Yet under each one of these pop-ups, say the Z position pop-up, I can not only pick the intensity of layer 2, but also the red, the green, the blue, the alpha channel of layer 2, and some slope values which actually view a grayscale map as a terrain map. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the foam section. But with grayscale maps, you're not going to see any difference between red, green, and blue because they all have equal amounts. Otherwise, you'd be seeing color in this image. Where you really get all of the control that you need, and you need a lot of different controls when you have X position, Y position, Z position, X rotation, Y and Z, plus X scale and Y scale. That's 8 different values that you potentially could use different channels to control. So instead of using grayscale gradients for maximum control, you can actually use color gradients. And that's what we're going to talk about in this next composition. So let's open up our custom channels composition and take a look at this wacky image that we have over here. Now what we have here is a composition that's designed to be a multi-channel displacement map for card dance. And we've created it by actually using the wonderful friend of card dance, and that is the Set Channels filter. Set Channels allows you to assign channels to your current layer by sampling them from another layer. And we have several different layers in our composition. We've got a light sweep movie, which is a grayscale movie with a light bar that animates from the right-hand side of the screen to the left. Does that a couple of times over 6 seconds. And it loops. We also have a pre-composition. That is a ripple image. There's no motion in this at all. If you examine the pre-comp, though, you'll see that it's a radial gradient generated with the ramp filter, followed by a squiggly curves filter, which gives us these concentric soft circles. And the third composition is a waves pre-composition. This actually has radio waves applied to it with certain settings that give us these soft moving waves. Now, as I've mentioned several times before, when a filter is looking at another layer for data, the information that it's getting has to be housed in a pre-comp or has to be a pre-rendered movie. It cannot look at effects that are local to the composition and use the results as a sample. So all of these layers that you see down here are either pre-composed or they are movies that have been pre-rendered and brought in. Now we chose as our source layer 1 the ripple movie, and we told it to use that as the red channel. Source layer 2, we picked the light sweep movie and said use that as our green layer. Source layer 3, we chose the waves movie and said use that as our blue layer. We're not going to bother with an alpha for now, but you could set a 4th layer in here if you wanted to. The results look kind of trippy, but if we check the channels one at a time, you'll see there's that image we just looked at in the red channel. Here's that image we just looked at in the green channel. And here's that other movie that we looked at hiding there in the blue channel. Combine those pixels all together and you get this nice multicolored thing that by itself could be an interesting background. But as an aid for card dance, it's going to be really fun. So let's shut this composition down and go to the next comp and take a look at how we would use a source file like this. I'll close this down and open up the matrix. I didn't want to get sued, so this is the matrix composition. Now in this composition, we have a couple of elements here. We have the numbers grid, which we can see up here. These are a bunch of numbers that are basically changing themselves randomly every couple of frames. It's a 10 frame per second random number grid. This was generated with Particle Playground, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. We also set this up on purpose to work with card dance. It's a bunch of 20 by 20 squares. So in a 720 by 540 composition, we have 36 columns and 27 rows. So if we enter those values into card dance, we should get a perfect grid. Now in addition to that, we have the custom channels composition that we just looked at. Here it is. Remember, we've got our red channel, which is our ripple. We have our green channel, which is this light sweep. And we have our blue channel, which are these waves. And we're going to use these channels to actually modulate the tiles that we see on this grid. Let me go ahead and open up the card dance effect, which I've already applied to this layer. In fact, I've already set it to 27 rows and 36 columns. And I've already set gradient layer 1 to be our custom channels. And just for laughs, I've also already set up camera controls so that as we move through this composition, we'll actually at one point pan in 3D space to match a move in the background. And it'll all look really cool. Let me go back to frame 0, and let's talk about some things that we can do now. Let's just choose, since we've got our custom channels, let's pick something really, really obvious. Let's set our X scale value to the blue channel. Remember, that's the waves channel of our gradient layer. And watch what happens. You can start to see the tiles are actually being scaled based on the grayscale values in that layer. And in fact, let's adjust our Y scale to use the exact same information so that it scales things proportionally. And look what we got here. We've got actually our tiles scaling to reflect the grayscale information that's being fed them. This is already going to be kind of an interesting effect. And if we generate a quick RAM preview, you'll see we get some very dynamic motion. Numbers are still going randomly, but now their sizes are completely determined by the animation of the waves that we saw in the blue channel. So what we've got is an interesting kind of ripple effect. Now, it's not very three-dimensional, but we'll be getting to that in just a second. For now, I'm going to turn that off. I'll go back to none on my X scale and none on my Y scale, so everything's back to normal. And let's take a look at something else, maybe our Z rotation. What if our Z rotation was now handled by the green channel? Now, the green channel was the light sweep channel. If we set that, you'll see, all the numbers have suddenly rotated 90 degrees to the right. And as the white light comes through the screen, you get kind of a ripple of rotation as the numbers rotate the other direction. So those bright values are actually rotating the values that we have to work with. That's very cool. Except I don't like the fact that everything is, by default, rotating 90 degrees to the right. This is actually being caused by the fact that the source map for this layer is a black solid with a white stripe coming through it. That means the black values are having negative displacement while the white values are having positive, and the intermediate grayscale values fill in the values between. This is when the offset value will allow us to tweak things. If we offset things now by 90 degrees, that will basically counteract the negative displacement that we were getting from the black values, and now the white values will rotate a full 180 degrees around from this neutral start point. And the results, if we preview that, are subtle, but you can see in there, if you look close, the numbers tumbling over upside down and then back right side up again. This is the kind of particle layer control that's otherwise very hard to do, but really, really easy to do in card dance. But of course, card dance is a fully 3D system, and we haven't really pushed the limits of 3D yet. Let's turn this property back off as well. Set that back to none. And instead, let's adjust our Z position based on the red channel. And remember, the red channel of our custom channels is this. It looks like a sort of blurry version of a hubcap. But these brightness values are going to distribute our layers very nicely in 3D space. Let's start out at about half a second, and with our red channel set to our source, let's set a keyframe for our multiplier for Z position at 0. And let's move out to about a second, and let's adjust this in negative space just a smidge. You'll start to see a little warping going on up in the screen. Isn't that cool? That's very cool, as those cards are displaced based on that curved map. And then let's jump out to about 2 seconds or so, and crank that back in the positive direction up to a nice big value that really breaks the particles apart and brings some of them really close to us here. That's nice. Now all of our numbers are turned sideways. Remember, in our Z rotation values, we'd set our offset to 90. So let's set that back to 0, and that brings everything back where it belongs. Let's hit the U key to sample the keyframes that we just set, select them, hit F9 to smooth that out, and let's preview this and take a look at what we got. Whoa, boom. Really interesting matrix effect as those cards are distributed wildly through 3D space, but you get those concentric rings because of the shape of the map that we use to generate them, and then a camera move. Man alive, that's just a really, really cool effect that would be almost impossible to create any other way inside After Effects. Now let's just, to add a little bit more dynamics to this effect, turn all of our various settings back on again to show that this one custom channels layer can control all of these different attributes at the same time. So if we went back down and told our Z rotation that we wanted to use the green channel, and once again we'd adjust our offset values by 90 to bring things back, and we wanted to adjust our X scale to the blue channel and our Y scale to the blue channel, we're going to get a combination of all of these different motions and all of these different animations working together to create a really interesting numeric animation. And the results really look like nothing else you could create anywhere, certainly inside After Effects, and probably not in most other applications as well. You have total control over all of these aspects of these individual cards, all by using grayscale values from other layers, and you have all the controls you need within After Effects to modify those values on a channel-by-channel basis to your heart's content and to the limits of your creativity. So, cool stuff. Now there's one last little troubleshooting thing I want to point out to you before we leave this section on card dance. And it's going to actually enter into a couple of other filters as well. We're just going to talk about it here, and that's the idea of transformation order. Now the order in which things take place inside a filter like card dance can be very important. We've already created a little animation here within this card dance layer. We've got a bunch of tiles that are shrunk down. As I hit the space bar, you'll see that once we get to about 1 second, they will move towards us. What's happening there is they're moving along their Z-axis. I've actually adjusted the Z offset so that the cards are moving towards us in 3D space. Then at about 2 seconds, the cards rotate to the right, then they rotate to the left, then they straighten back out again, and they come back to their initial position by once again animating the Z position offset of the card back down to 0. It's important to know that I'm not animating the camera in any way. These are simply the cards doing what you see here. Okay? Now, remember what that looks like. And let's bring open our card dance filter. And there's a property in here that we skipped over earlier called transformatio ... Well, if we open that up a little bit, you'll see that means transformation order. And this pop-up allows us to set the exact order in which things happen inside this filter. Right now, the layers are set to scale first, then rotate around each card's relative anchor point, and then adjust the position. So, since the scaling happens first, the cards are the size that they are, then rotate happens next in order, and then position, so that the results are, once we get out here into position, you can see that by keeping the transformation order in its default settings, the cards will simply rotate around their new position. Okay? But if we change just the last two properties, scale, position, rotate, instead of scale, rotate, position, what that means is it's going to look the same up until about 2 seconds. But now, from this point on, instead of calculating the rotation first and then the position, it's now going to calculate the position first, and instead of the animation that we saw before, let me generate a RAM preview of this, we get an animation that looks like this. Because once again, within the context of card dance, each card is being offset along its anchor point in Z space, and then the rotation happens, and the results are we end up with these kind of piston-style animations where the rotation happens around an offset anchor point. So big difference from scaling towards us and then just pivoting around the anchor point as if the anchor point were still local to the card. So you have absolute control over the transformation order and even the rotation order. Every possible permutation of those things is available to you here in these pop-ups. So if you're attempting to create a kind of an animation and for some reason it's just not working out, you're not getting the behavior that you expect from card dance, try adjusting the transformation orders and seeing if you can actually find a setting in here that will give you your desired results. So that's our basic look at card dance.